As early as 1969, NASA officials, including the administrator at the time, Thomas O. Paine, had proposed a permanent base on the Moon by the end of the 1970s and a manned Mars landing by 1982. Plans were already well underway for an unmanned cargo lunar module, known as the LM truck, which would transport the necessary equipment to a moon base.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main bus undervolt.
However, after the alleged near disaster of Apollo 13, the last Apollo missions were abruptly cut and the exploration of space was sent back to the Stone Age. In January 1972, Richard Nixon approved of the vehicle NASA would use to replace the Apollo spacecraft. This is the Space Shuttle, currently the world's only reusable manned spacecraft. It is designed to carry astronauts into orbit and is capable of carrying a 30-ton payload. At liftoff, the shuttle is propelled into space using a cluster of 3 Rocketdyne RS-24s, more commonly known as the Space Shuttle Main Engines, or SSMEs. They run together on liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, fed directly to them from a giant external tank mounted onto the shuttle's belly. Understandably, the heaviest part of any rocket is the propellants. Subsequently, at liftoff, the tank has a gross weight of 800 tons, well outside the shuttle's lifting capacity. So, this is where the shuttle's solid rocket boosters come in. The solid rocket boosters, or SRBs, are made up of 7 steel segments encasing a tube of hardened fuel. These segments are held together with thick rubber O-rings. At liftoff, the SRBs carry the entire weight of the shuttle's external tank for 2 minutes, before they are spent and must be jettisoned to save weight. The boosters parachute back down to Earth to be recovered and refueled for the next flight. 10 seconds after the SSMEs stop, the tank too is jettisoned. It burns up on re-entry, leaving the shuttle's main engines essentially unpowered. The shuttle is held in orbit by the Earth's gravity. In orbit, the shuttle launches its payloads and docks with other spacecraft. When it's time to re-enter the atmosphere, it lands like a glider.
Good touchdown.
Of course, the shuttle would not fly until 1981, and is proving to be unreliable and inferior to its predecessor.
Apollo 11, this is Houston. You are go for TLI, over.
Not only that, but the vehicle is very unsafe.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Roger, go at throttle up.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
Although quite more spacious than the Apollo craft, the shuttle was initially designed to carry only 2 astronauts. Because both astronauts rode in the cockpit, it was pretty simple to give each crew member an ejection seat should anything go wrong during liftoff. However, by the 5th shuttle flight, equipment needed to be removed to accommodate additional astronauts, including the ejection seats for the command pilot and a pilot.
With ejection seats gone from the flight deck, and water storage tanks and instrumentation gone from the middeck, there was much more room to accommodate the larger crew.
And because most of the crews ride mid-deck during launch, there would be no way to save them from an explosion, even if the crew compartment survived it.
Reports from the flight dynamics officer indicate that the vehicle apparently exploded and that impact.
Right at the beginning of his re-election campaign, George W. Bush proposed his vision for space exploration.
Our third goal is to return to the moon by 2020 as the launching point for missions beyond. Beginning no later than 2008, we will send a series of robotic missions to the lunar surface to research and prepare for future human exploration. Using the crew exploration vehicle, we will undertake extended human missions to the moon as early as 2015, with the goal of living and working there for increasingly extended periods of time.
However, by 2006, it was becoming apparent that NASA's new moon rocket, or should I say moon rockets, were not turning out to be what were initially promised. When Bush proposed his vision for space exploration, the initial decision was to use two rockets. One to launch the crew exploration vehicle, now called the Orion spacecraft, and a larger, more powerful, heavy lift vehicle to launch the Lunar Surface Access Module into space. As with the Gemini program, the unmanned payload would be launched first. Then, the crew would be sent up to dock in Earth orbit. From there, the heavy lift vehicle's Earth departure stage would blast the two craft towards the moon. The crew launch vehicle became known as Rs-1. The cargo launcher became known as Rs-5. The plan was to build these rockets from existing shuttle technology. For example, both Rs rockets would respectively use a cluster or a single space shuttle main engine mounted directly beneath a large external tank. These would have made up the first stage of the Rs-5 and the second stage of the Rs-1. However, this turned out to be unfeasible. The SSMEs are cost-effective on the shuttle because they always return to Earth with the shuttle. On the Rs rockets, these stages would forever be lost in space, and thus these engines could no longer be reusable. Instead, a cluster of Rocketdyne RL-68s would make up the first stage of the Rs-5, and a single Rocketdyne J2X would make up the second stage of the Rs-1. In addition, the crew departure stage was originally supposed to use two of these J2 engines. Now, it only uses the one, as its Saturn IV predecessor did. More recently, NASA has needed to redesign the Rs-5 in order to give it additional lifting power. The rocket is now 20 feet taller, and the first stage now has 6 engines. Right from the beginning, NASA had proposed running both the Orion capsule and the LSAM on methane fuel, because methane could be mined from both the surfaces of the Moon and Mars, thus cutting costs by using natural resources. However, that didn't go as planned, because methane-powered engines are still a long way away. So the Orion was reduced to using hypergolics, and the new lunar module, called Alta, the same liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen used on the space shuttle. It's worth noting that both Rs rockets are still intended to use enlarged versions of the Space Shuttle's solid rocket boosters. George W. Bush also promised the first launch of the Rs-1 by 2008. It seems that promise has been broken.
The new Orion spacecraft is expected to launch in 2014.
You know, you take a look at that whole situation with the moon landing and you say to yourself, why haven't we gone back?
Typically, whenever someone asks this, the answer they usually get is budget. Yet, NASA's new launch vehicles will be built upon the same space shuttle technology developed as early as 1969.
The shuttle is a 25-year-old dinosaur, which is due to retire in 2010.
We are flying with 1970 vintage electronics. Now think about that for a minute. What do you have in your house that's electronic that is unchanged since, the late 1970s?
In fact, the new Moon program will use the exact same engine used on Apollo's trans-Earth injection.